Hello, and welcome to the 5th episode of Water Solutions for Our Warmer World. This afternoon, our topic is water and infrastructure, building for the future. We have an array of experts to share their perspectives with you. Tonight's episode is a little different from prior ones because it focuses on infrastructure in the context of equity and does not focus solely on water-related infrastructure. On behalf of the Arizona Institutes for Resilience, the Office of Research, Innovation, and Impact at the University of Arizona, and our co-sponsors, the Water Resources Research Center and the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy, I'd like to thank you all for joining this afternoon. My name is Kathy Jacobs, and I'm the director of the Center for Climate Adaptation, Science, and Solutions, which is within the Arizona Institutes for Resilience. Before we get started, we have a few Zoom tips for you. First of all, we'd like you to use the question and answer area at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit questions for panelists. The actual responses to your questions will be at the end of the episode. We'll try to choose a broad cross-section of questions, but we will not be able to get to everyone's questions. In fact, in past episodes, we've really only been able to touch on a few of them, but we do want to hear from you. So please do use the question and answer component. This episode is being recorded and will be available for review in a couple of days. We'll actually let you know when it's available on the Arizona Institutes for Resilience website. We will give you the link for that in the chat. We hope to learn about what works and what doesn't through these webinars, and so we will be sending you a request to review what you've seen and give us feedback. So please do take advantage of that. We are very happy to welcome all of you to our conversation today. We had almost 200 people who were signed up for this event. I'm not sure how many will actually sign in today, but we're very happy to welcome all of you. Before we begin our discussion, this series is dedicated to our former colleague, Jim Shuttleworth, a Regents professor who worked at the University of Arizona for several decades. He played a major role in understanding the role of the water cycle and how it relates to climate change. He passed away this last December. There's more about his life and family and a video about his contributions in the chat. I'm now going to introduce tonight's moderator, Courtney Crossan, who is a licensed architect and assistant professor of architecture, planning, and landscape architecture at the University of Arizona. We are pleased that she is joining us as a moderator in part because of her broad perspective on the topic of infrastructure in the context of the built environment. Courtney, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and it's wonderful to be here with you all this evening. This webinar, Water and Infrastructure, Building for the Future, will explore several aspects of resilient infrastructure. For example, how conversations about infrastructure in DC can affect social and environmental justice, what role architects and engineers play in building resilient infrastructure, how green infrastructure contributes to resilient water supply solutions, and the latest innovations in community design that can be scaled up for broader application. We encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A area of your Zoom window during this event. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome Kathleen Kelly from the Center for American Progress as our keynote speaker tonight. Kathleen is a senior fellow for energy and environment at the Center for American Progress. She specializes in US and international climate mitigation, preparedness, resilience, justice, and sustainable development policy. Kathleen co-leads the Equitable and Just National Climate Forum and Platform in partnership with environmental justice advocates and national environmental groups. Kathleen previously served in the Obama administration at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, where she led a 20+ agency task force to develop a national climate resilience strategy. Kathleen, thank you for joining us, and I turn it over to you for our opening keynote remarks.
Thank you so much, Courtney. It's an honor to be here, and a big thanks to the University of Arizona for hosting this event and to all of you for joining. This conversation on water and our nation's infrastructure could not come at a more critical time. The challenges we are facing are unprecedented, from the worst pandemic and public health crisis in a century to the accelerating effects of climate change. In this summer alone, 1 in 3 Americans dealt with a climate disaster, from record-breaking heat that killed hundreds to devastating hurricanes, floods, droughts, and wildfires. And these impacts were felt in every corner of the country. In fact, climate catastrophes that were once projected in previous scientific reports are now actually happening. And this underscores the high cost of inaction and the need to invest urgently in solutions to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels to avoid even worse impacts. At the same time, our nation is amid a long overdue racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd spotlighted systemic and brutal racial injustice and economic inequalities. And among these injustices is the historic practice in our country of concentrating our nation's most toxic sources of pollution in Black, Latino, Indigenous, and other communities of color. High pollution in these communities leads to higher rates of cancer, asthma, cardiovascular disease, and other life-threatening health problems that cut off opportunities to participate equally in the economy and live healthy and prosperous lives. And many of these same communities also lack access to safe drinking water. To address these challenges, environmental justice and national environmental groups co-authored and launched in 2019 the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. And this was a process led by environmental justice advocates in partnership with CAP and other national groups. This was the first ever national climate platform that centered on racial, economic, and environmental justice. And it lays out a strong vision for a healthy climate and air quality for all, safe and healthy communities and infrastructure, and access to affordable and clean water, electricity, and transportation for every community. Fortunately, many of these priorities are reflected in the Biden administration's climate agenda, most notably the president's commitment to deliver 40% of climate and infrastructure investment benefits to disadvantaged communities. Now, Congress and the Biden administration have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to join forces and really turn the tide against environmental injustice and climate change while improving the lives and livelihoods of all Americans. And this opportunity lies in a major infrastructure package and Build Back Better bill that Congress is currently shepherding toward the finish line. These two bills combined have the potential to be the largest action ever taken to curb greenhouse gas emissions, clean up pollution in communities, make childcare more affordable, expand access to healthcare, and increase economic opportunities among individuals and communities where it was previously denied. To be clear, this is our climate and justice moment, and Congress and the Biden administration must secure a Build Back Better Act that meaningfully tackles climate change by putting us on the path to cut pollution in half by 2030. This is a tall order, but a new report that was released just yesterday by the Rhodium Group finds that this goal is within reach, but only with bold congressional investments, ambitious regulations from the Biden administration, and actions by states. And specifically, the Build Back Better bill must include tax credits for wind and solar and clean vehicles and manufacturing to spark that rapid deployment of clean energy and electric vehicles that we so desperately need. In addition, the bill must invest in efficient electric homes and buildings, not only to reduce emissions, but to lower energy costs for families. With these investments and others, and strong Clean Air Act regulations, the Build Back Better Act has the potential to be transformative. It has the potential to create millions of clean energy jobs, build a more equitable economy, and take on climate change. What's more is these bold investments and regulations combined will slash average household energy costs by $500 annually. Anything less than these investments that are in the Build Back Better bill and administrative action will fail the climate test that science and this moment really demand of our lawmakers. In addition to addressing climate change, communities facing risks from pollution are counting on Congress to invest in cleaning up toxic pollution in their neighborhoods. And this includes replacing diesel trucks and school buses with zero emissions vehicles, cleaning up Superfund sites, replacing lead service lines so that communities can drink safe and clean water, and more. In addition, Congress must invest in cleaning up our nation's ports, where diesel-operated equipment and vehicles emit toxic pollution that undermines the public health and air quality in communities nearby. To build back better, Congress cannot leave communities behind. This means that Congress must invest in equitable and sustainable community development, including affordable, climate-ready housing, clean and affordable energy and transportation, and parks and green spaces to reduce flood and heat risks. In addition, Congress must invest in environmental and climate justice block grants and create a new civilian climate corps to train a new generation of workers to access the clean energy economy, earn fair wages, and develop sustainable careers that focus on improving the health and climate resilience of communities. These investments, as well as other climate and clean energy investments in the Build Back Better bill, are transformative and should not be left on the cutting room floor. As President Biden has said, the climate crisis is blinking code red for humanity. Communities bombarded with pollution cannot afford to wait for long overdue investments to address public health and climate threats in their neighborhoods. The Build Back Better Act is our best chance to meet this moment by meaningfully addressing climate change and environmental injustice. There is simply too much at stake for Congress to fail. Our families, communities, and planet are really counting on lawmakers to follow through on their promises and deliver a strong infrastructure package and Build Back Better Act by the deadline at the end of this month. Congress must meet this opportunity and their responsibility to pass this legislation to improve the lives and livelihoods of millions of Americans for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was a great platform for us to start our conversation. And it is now my pleasure to welcome our three other panelists. I will introduce them and then invite them each to make 5-minute remarks in the order that they are introduced. First, David Hurd is a managing partner for Bureau Happold, California. He recently led the California team in the delivery of the Santa Monica East City Hall, a high sustainable net zero energy and net zero water building that is on track to be the largest Living Building Challenge certified project for a municipality in the world. He also led the Los Angeles County-wide sustainability plan, which seeks to balance the environment, equity, and the economy. Welcome, David. Dr. Adriana Zuniga-Turan works for University of Arizona as an assistant research scientist at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy and the School of Landscape Architecture and Planning. Dr. Zuniga works with stakeholders and community partners to answer questions related to water scarcity, water security, urban resilience, and environmental justice by focusing on green space, green infrastructure across the urban-rural continuum. Welcome, Adriana. And then thirdly, Dr. Bilal Ayub is professor and director at the Center for Technology and Systems Management at University of Maryland. His main research interests are risk, uncertainty, expert opinion elicitation, and decision analysis, and systems engineering applied to infrastructure, naval, energy, defense, and maritime fields. Welcome, Bilal. So I'll now turn it over to David for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Courtney, and good afternoon, everyone. I actually started my work in water conservation back in 1999 with design of a water recycling and grey water recycling system for a water supply company HQ in the UK. We were collecting rainwater from about 30,000 square feet of roof and using it for toilet flushing, and we also had a demonstration grey water recycling system for the bathroom sink. So, over 20 years ago, we were doing this work, and it still feels like a long time coming with the adoption of these types of systems. More recently, my work has continued largely at the building scale here in the US, with examples of like UCLA and the Museum of Nature and Science in Dallas, where we've been incorporating rainwater and grey water recycling there again for toilet flushing or condenser water makeup for the AC systems. It's always been sort of frustrating dealing with one building at a time. Trying to change the world one building at a time is got to take more than my lifetime. More recently, though, what's been interesting, we've been starting to work with counties and cities, master planning in the corporate scale, developing long-term sustainability and resiliency strategies to address water conservation and recycling. And that's really started to take us into a new realm of long-term change, which particularly here in California is really needed. We've just finished a climate vulnerability assessment for LA County, which the climate models project that 65% increase in mega droughts between the mid and end of this century. So we need change. I've got 3 points to make in my 3 minutes left. One, we need joined up leadership. Kathleen talked about what's going on at federal level, but we need this all joined up through federal, state, county, city, corporate, the development-led sectors to really push through this change. At the moment, too much happens in a sort of disaggregated way, which means you're almost always reinventing the wheel. Courtney talked about the city of Santa Monica, great exemplar project. You need those stars to shine. Microsoft at the corporate level, targeting replenishing more water than they've consumed by 2030. It's great. We've got to show the way. Work we've done with the UCLA on their water recycling. Two, we need to continue to develop new ordinance. At the end of the day, I've trained in Europe, and Europe was very good at instigating regulations on carbon emissions in particular in the 90s, which is gradually over a 25-year period driven down carbon emissions and eventually embedded it into the culture. So we need to develop new ordinances that drive real change, net zero water ordinances, particularly for new developments, establishing pilot programs, adopting changes to the building code. And then three, streamlining the approvals process. I worked on the City of Santa Monica project for 5 years. It was pretty painful trying to get a net zero water building, trying to get through the state, county, city, jurisdictional issues, technical issues, procurement problems. It's a risky and expensive adventure and not one to be taken by the faint-hearted. So we need more investment to create a more coordinated response, pre-selection of materials, there again, really looking at the whole process and the associated supply chain. So those are my sort of 3 points. Fundamentally joined up leadership, develop new ordinance, streamline the approvals process, and above all, make water sexy. You know, carbon is very important, but has really taken the sort of big attention over the last 25 years. And here in California, everyone shouts at us, you know, when there's a big drought. But that's not the way to do this. So, you know, often saving water is not sexy. It doesn't, you know, it's not sexy PVs or wind turbines or sexy architecture. You know, it's often black boxes stuck in a basement somewhere doing all the hard work. But really making water sexy would help, because the answer is in our control, in our reduction, our conservation, and our reuse measures. Thanks, Courtney.
Thanks, David. Adriana.
Thank you, Courtney. Kathleen spoke about the 2 top-down initiatives to enhance resilience of our infrastructure systems. I want to highlight local efforts at the city level. I'm talking about greening, or the planting of trees and the development of parks or other type of green space. This is something cities can do regardless of the outcomes in Congress. Creating hybrid systems that combine gray infrastructure with nature-based solutions can enhance infrastructure resilience. Green infrastructure is a nature-based solution that can reduce flooding, mitigate heat, and provide recreational opportunities which are becoming critical during the pandemic. As a researcher at the University of Arizona, I study greening efforts in cities in general and in Tucson in particular. I live in a city that is a recognized leader in promoting green infrastructure in the country. The University of Arizona has green infrastructure across many programs and research areas. Our own moderator, my colleague Courtney Crosson, works on this topic too. She partners with county officials to develop green infrastructure projects for Tucson. Well, in my work, I examine justice issues around green infrastructure. In most cities in the world, low-income neighborhoods have less access to green space and are more vulnerable to climate change than wealthy neighborhoods. And Tucson is not an exception. Through our projects, we clearly see that green infrastructure relates to multiple disciplines because of its multifunctionality. For example, a park can provide recreational opportunities during dry times and serve as a retention basin during a storm event. In this case, we have landscape architects, we have park managers, we have flood control staff, all working on the same space, but looking at it from different lenses. And all disciplines acknowledge equity and justice issues. Through a review study that we conducted on the multidisciplinarity aspect of justice in urban green space, we find that greening the public realm or planting trees along the streets and creating a connected network of green space are efficient ways to increase access to green space for all residents. But here's the catch. Greening for greening's sake doesn't work. Planting trees without engaging the community in the planning and decision-making processes may result in more injustices. For example, building a beautiful park in a poor neighborhood that was deprived of vegetation may result in gentrification or the displacement of renters to other poor areas of the city. In my projects, I study community engagement in greening efforts in low-income neighborhoods. We partner with local organizations such as Watershed Management Group and others, and we find that partnerships are critical for making things happen. We work with schools because they can act as bridges to the community. And we involve university students in youth mentoring programs to promote engagement. I put a link to one of our projects titled Tucson Verde para Todos on the chat. Here you can find more information on this work. In addition to on-the-ground projects, we recently conducted a systematic literature review on the intersection of green space and justice. This paper was published just yesterday, and I am adding a link to it on the chat as well. In this study, we find that injustice in the distribution of green space is only the tip of the iceberg. We find that procedural aspects of greening are at the core of justice issues, and community engagement shows promise in addressing these challenges. In short, cities must not lose valuable time. They must invest resources in greening their streets and in creating multifunctional and connected green space networks. Cities must identify vulnerable communities and place them at the forefront of these initiatives. Investing in community engagement for inclusive greening efforts is the way to enhance urban resilience in an equitable and just way. And I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Bilal?
Yeah, thank you, Courtney, for the introduction. I'd like to focus on the role of climate resilient infrastructure in having resilient and sustainable communities. The term infrastructure will cover basically, power grid and transportation systems and telecommunication and so on. We know that each year governments and the private sector spend trillions of dollars in infrastructure construction annually. In the US, in fact, according to the US Bureau of Census, the expenditure in a year is 1.3 trillion based on 2020. And there is big challenges facing those countries, not only in the US, but in developing countries and globally, that there is the pressure of the disaster intensity is increasing, the rates is increasing, and also there is urbanization, which stresses the infrastructure. And we have stressors that demonstrate the ability of those systems to actually deal with storms and events. For example, if we look at Hurricane Harvey, Maria, and Irma, we have a very total damage based on those three events is $265 billion, making that year, I think they all happened in 2017, is one of the worst and most expensive years. So in the American Society of Civil Engineers, as well as ASME, mechanical engineering, there is big interest in designing our new systems that are expected to live or to be around for a long time. The planning horizon, typically it could be 50 to 100 years, and most of the time we'll end up keeping them even longer. So there is big interest in creating resilient infrastructure, not for the sake of having resilient infrastructure, but for supporting resilient communities. And certainly equity plays a major role in there. The academies organized a meeting, I think in 2018, I participated in, which was looking at communities at risk and the impact of a changing climate. The same thing, NOAA last year, they had a special focus on equity when it comes to resource allocation for enhancing infrastructure. I'd like to bring to your attention two documents that were released by the American Society of Civil Engineers, and I had the opportunity to lead the effort in both of them. One is called Climate Resilient Infrastructure, that came out in 2018, and I think a link will be added in there in the chat. And the other one is Hazard Resilient Infrastructure, that just came out this year in 2021. As well as ASCE is finalizing a standard, a new standard, Standard 73, which is on sustainable infrastructure. It went through the public comments, and now it's going through the last voting process. One of the items that I have in all of these documents is the coverage of economics and socioeconomics. I mean, certainly engineers, we train our engineers to look at the economics as well as the engineering and the math and so on, because at the very end, we have to make sure that the solutions are cost effective. So looking at the economics, typically we tend to provide resources. It's all about resource allocation, limited resources, provide the resources that will have the largest impact on the economic output. But then the economic output is already placed with inequity to it. So that approach overall, which is typically used by economists, it has to be revisited. And now when it comes to socioeconomics, what we've done, we looked at the extent of damage in the production of a region, or it could be a city or a country, production like GDP and so on, after an event, and you look at the loss in welfare, we call it, and if that loss in welfare is compared to the total asset loss, infrastructure loss, the ratio is used by economists at the World Bank and other places as a measure of socioeconomics. So it's possible to take that to a granular level and examine it in terms of what's the extent of loss that will have in an infrastructure in different communities, and what's the level of welfare loss. And those ratios could create a spatial distribution of where the welfare, the socioeconomic measure will be deficient. Now, one of the items that we have to deal with in looking at or designing for infrastructure is uncertainty. With a changing climate, we are dealing with a different type of uncertainty. It's an uncertainty type, which we call it sometimes deep uncertainty, meaning it's not just stochastic or random, but it's really based on a set of assumptions about the future, where we don't know which way the energy consumption will, what the form of the energy consumption and the behavior of people and so on. And that as a result, there is a need for designing infrastructure to make them adaptable. So there is a design philosophy, which is called adaptive design, where we create real options in the infrastructure design to enable changing that infrastructure in the future if the challenges become higher than what we projected now. And if it doesn't become higher, then we invested a little bit in creating those options. And this could be justified based on low regret decision criteria. The other item that we've done is we interacted with policymakers. We had a document that was done with the Hoover Institution, and it's and I think I sent a link to that. It's basically we examined what are the policy options for building resilient infrastructure, and we came up with basically 3 requirements that we need to have. We need to do proper planning for future risks. We need to think about things systematically. And there is a need for mainstreaming green infrastructure, which is along the lines of what Adriana mentioned, that we need to bring the co-benefits that will come with a green infrastructure by mixing the gray infrastructure with nature-based and natural-based solutions. We did recently a workshop that was done for the National Wildlife Service, Fish and Wildlife, and basically we have many refuges are at threat, and really we can't do anything about it. I mean, basically we see them disappearing, and there is a major item that we have to deal with in there. If they cannot be protected, we could maybe change the course of progression of things in a manner that we think is most logical and most reasonable. So that's an item which is of great importance, because those ecosystems, they support life in a very complex manner, and they do feed in the food chain and the energy and the and CO2 and all of that. With that, I'd like to conclude that there is a need to have a coordination between policy and engineering practices so that we'll achieve cost-effective solutions for the purpose of climate resilient infrastructure. Such coordination will deepen the relationship and the understanding and the appreciation, and also on exchange of information, so that the policymakers, the planners, and the designers, they have appreciations to the technological as well as the resource limitations that we are dealing with. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to start off the panel by working on a broad definition. Kathleen spoke about the work that's currently going on at a national level with resilient infrastructure. And it seems that the term infrastructure is broadening in definition. So my question to each one of you is, how do you define resilient infrastructure, and particularly in the work that you're doing, since we're all coming from different vantage points? You can start in any order.
Should I start?
Great, thank you, Adriana.
Well, the definition of resilient infrastructure would be the continuous functioning of infrastructure systems that provide shelter, water, waste, energy, and transportation services no matter what stressors or hazards may affect the system. But from my own work, we know that urban resilience is not only about infrastructure systems, it's also about social networks, about partnerships, and a diversity of resources. People who have a wide social network do better during catastrophes than isolated and lonely people. Likewise, cities that have a diversity of employment opportunities do better during a pandemic, for example. The same for energy, water, housing, and transportation systems. Cities that provide a diversity of options for these services are better prepared to withstand disasters and adapt to climate change. That's my definition.
If I may, I'd like to add to Adriana's definition. I totally agree with everything she said, because that's the way we deal with it in engineering. It's the persistence of the functionality of a system. And the system could be a cyber, social, physical system, right? In general terms. All of those, the mix or individually, it has a certain function. And the persistence of that function, if there is a disturbance, is a way to what we call resilience. And now in my work, I focus on quantification, because at the very end, to maintain consistency across the board in dealing with many systems and to justify the resource allocation, we need to have a proper way of quantifying things. I collaborate a lot with people at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in terms of measurement science. So quantifying, if you look at resilience as a term, how can I quantify it? It's a notion, it's not a physical object. So we have series of documents that look at quantifications. And when we come up with a quantification method, I always make sure that it's tied to economic valuation. Because if that quantification, if somebody uses scoring, for example, it doesn't lend itself for economic valuation, there will be a disconnect with decision makers. So it comes from the metric has to be ideally physics-based, links to the actual phenomenon and so on. And it should be probabilistic in nature because there is a lot of uncertainty, and it should feed into economic models. And I'll stop there.
I think in the past, too much we've looked at every problem in isolation, and we look at resiliency by system rather than as a holistic, as everything being one holistic system. And so I think more understanding modeling across the social, economic, and environmental issues, and then coming up with solutions that are cross-cutting rather than just simply reduce energy by this, reduce water by this. The points that are being made by Adriana about the tree canopies. Often low-income families, districts, you don't have a lot of tree canopies, so they're suffering from the heat exhaustion and issues like that, or additional air conditioning loads. So I think really it's ultimately going to come down to, though, there's a certain finite resource that we can model. And at a political level, having to step back and say, in order to create an overall resilient model, where are we going to place those resources? And that's going to require some really difficult decisions across everything from agriculture to transportation to who's going to carry the cost of all this.
Those are all great points. And I really agree with everything that David, Adriana, and Bilal have said. From the perspective of CAP and the way we view resilient infrastructure through the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, we really see it as the backbone of what allows people to participate in the economy and live healthy, prosperous lives in healthy communities that can withstand the impacts of climate change and other shocks. And, as David was saying, there's this tendency to silo different systems. There's also a tendency in the climate policy world, maybe the climate science world, to silo climate resilience and adaptation in a silo that's different from mitigating or reducing emissions that are causing climate change. And at CAP and through the platform, we really see resilient infrastructure as tackling both. How do you have resilient infrastructure if it's not also supporting a rapid shift away from fossil fuels and putting our nation on the path that we need to be on to cut emissions in half by 2030? And that's what the science is saying we need to do to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And through that lens, our work is specifically asking Congress and the Biden administration to invest in resilient infrastructure like clean and affordable energy and transportation, in cleaning up pollution in local communities, in affordable housing that can withstand climate impacts, lead-free water pipes. How can you be resilient to shocks and climate stress if you're drinking water that's contaminated with lead? I mean, this is all resilient infrastructure. Coastal restoration that reduces carbon emissions and creates local jobs and can improve the economy of local communities while also improving resilience to disaster. That is resilient infrastructure. All of the infrastructure that Adriana talked about, parks, trees, green space, that is critical resilient infrastructure, and totally agree with her point that those projects need to be designed with meaningful community engagement. In fact, all of these infrastructure projects that I'm describing, all of them need to be designed with meaningful community input and engagement. The last thing I'll say is I think most of the pieces I've talked about are physical aspects of resilient physical infrastructure. There's also resilient social infrastructure, which Adriana and others touched on. There's job training programs, affordable childcare, access to healthcare. Those are all part of our social infrastructure that are essential to improving people's lives and livelihoods and allowing everyone to participate in the economy. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. Well, I think that was a really great discussion, and a lot of points were raised that are interconnected and very challenging as we take on pushing forward on resilient infrastructure. One thing I want to return to is this idea of measurement, of how we measure resilient infrastructure. And then some of what David was talking about is, we have these data sets, and then how do we prioritize? Because we do have limited resources. And if we have an expanded definition of infrastructure, and if we agree that we need both the built and the social aspects together holistically, how do we begin to measure our success? And then how do we begin to prioritize? I wonder if Bilal can you take that on first?
I mean, measurement is key, and it's not, and it's going to be multi-dimensional with many dimensions. Because, if you look at one system, let's say water distribution, right? Water distribution system, when I collaborated with people at the LA district in this area, they identified 5 performance measures for the water distribution system. Number 1 is the amount of water available for fire. This is number 1, right? We have to make sure that we have enough water for fire, because if there is an earthquake, that what we could lose from a fire could far exceed the damage that will come from an earthquake. So availability of the fire hydrant is number 1. Number 2 is volume of water that's available for consumption. The number 3 is the quality of that water, because we could provide the volume, but maybe not the quality. And the next one is the reliability of the network itself, right? And there is another dimension. So you could see that here's a water distribution. There are 5 metrics there, right? Now I could do the same thing with the transportation. We're doing some work at the present for the Federal Railroad Administration on freight network. And we know how it's the impact on supply chain with truck drivers and so on, and the delays that's happening recently. We're doing some work in metro systems, and we saw the flooding in New York with the metro system and so on. So there you could identify a series of metrics. And now, let's say if we do that for all the systems, can I really aggregate those metrics, even if they are consistent? Let's say if I design a metric system where deliberately I have it done in a consistent manner to lend itself for aggregation. Do we really understand how enhancing water distribution, enhancing transportation, and all of this will end up increasing the well-being or changing the well-being of an individual in a city? We don't know how things come together, right? So I do classify metrics into two types. There are metrics that are individually done, multidimensional. They could be aggregated, but then there are other metrics, I call them integration metrics. Those metrics, because we don't really understand the physics, we don't understand how transportation, water, and so on, and air quality and so on will end up enhancing the ability of somebody to find a job and produce more. So integration metrics will include consumption level, it includes economic output, and there are more of those. So it's multidimensional at the system level. Sometimes we could aggregate them, meaning we could add them up, combine them, and so on. And sometimes we have to identify new metrics that will be aggregate in nature, integration in nature. They integrate things naturally. And most of the time, these integral or integrated metrics, if I may call them, they tend to be of the economic type.
Yeah. David, I wonder, building on that question and that answer, if you could talk about, how you did this in LA with the county-wide sustainability plan and beyond measurement, how and prioritization, how do you make those decisions? And what do you do if your measurements tell you you designed it incorrectly?
Never design incorrectly.
Yeah.
That's the precursor I should have put across the bottom of this podcast or video. The problem is you can get caught up in this sort of cycle. You come up with the idea, you agree a direction, you measure it, then people start arguing with the measurement and whether it's correct or not, and then you go around in circles. To a certain extent, it really always comes back to political leadership. In that, we've produced the biggest thing we did on the LA County plan is the original brief was to look at everything by the traditional silos. What would be an appropriate cut in carbon, what would be an appropriate cut in water, waste, et cetera, et cetera. And so the first thing we did is just turned it on its side and said, right, okay, if those things are running horizontally, what could we have now vertically to create a more cross-cutting, holistic overview? And so when you look at the plan, it doesn't say reduce water by this certain amount. It creates broader themes which bring together all of these issues and say we need to tackle this. The challenge becomes one, and the goal 12 was, and make it implementable. And ultimately the implementable bit then becomes a political decision as to, well, what rules and regulations are you going to, tax incentivization are you going to change? And that's where it gets stuck. You look at resilient infrastructure. I started work on the Transbay Transit Center here in 2008, which I arrived in the US, phenomenal, high-speed rail connecting San Francisco to LA down to San Diego. That building is now finished, and there's a bit of high-speed rail being built in the middle of the Central Valley. And that was 13 years ago we started on that. So, these things can take incredibly long time. And to a certain extent, we just need more political will to make the tough choices, because they are tough choices. And I think that's where it often gets stuck. And so what you end up with is smaller exemplars, or a certain organization, Microsoft or whatever, making certain decisions. But that ain't enough. It needs real direct political will to make the change.
Thanks, David. Adriana or Kathleen, were you going to say something? I mean, I
have something to say, but I'm happy to hear from Adriana first. Sure.
Well, in terms of assessment, we did a study on I work with green space, so I have to go back to green space, but the resilience aspect of green space, how do we measure? We asked those questions, and we brought together a team of an engineer, Kevin Lancy from the U of A, a social scientist, Brian Mayer, a geographer, Tom Evans, and Andrea Gerlach, another geographer, to try to assess how much resilience was increasing with green infrastructure system. It was a tough question, I know, but we realize it's multidimensional, that you can look at it from policy, it's one dimension, what promotes the adoption of green infrastructure, then the performance aspect, the engineering aspect, the assessment of green infrastructure impacts on water infrastructure systems resilience, the connectivity aspect of green space, how the people and wildlife move across the urban landscape, and finally the social aspect of resilience, community cohesion as a result of GI efforts. We notice exactly what David and Bill are adding, that it's cross-cutting, right? We argue that beyond their individual contributions of each dimension to urban resilience, the interactions across the various dimensions are key to enhancing resilience. And ultimately, I need to insist, but participatory processes are needed to assess really resilience originating from green infrastructure systems.
Courtney, I was going to address your question on how do we prioritize? We have all these investments that are needed. And, the way I think about that is, what can we not afford to do, right? Everyone's talking about how expensive this infrastructure and Build Back Better packages. But when you look at the crises that we're facing, and the investments that are needed, and you start to do the math on what can we not afford to do, it becomes quickly clear very quickly. We have delayed investment in climate action for decades. Congress knew that climate change was a huge threat to communities and our country and the globe, people around the planet in the 80s. And, sadly did not take action. And now here we are just this year. The year's not even over. There's been 18 disasters that have each cost $1 billion or more, each of them. And we still have several months to go. And last year it was worse. It's just the trajectory is the costs are getting higher and higher. We cannot afford to delay action any further. The costs are too high. It's the same as on investing in resilient infrastructure. Why would we invest in infrastructure that's built using design codes that don't take more extreme weather, more extreme heat, flood risks? All of those threats are accelerating with climate change. Why would we not invest in infrastructure that is built to higher standards and better codes that takes those risks into account? If we keep using business as usual design codes, we're going to have to spend billions, hundreds of billions of dollars rebuilding the same infrastructure, the same housing, the same parks over and over again. We can't afford to not invest in resilient infrastructure. And then the last point I'll make is, I talked in the opening about how we've for decades or more concentrated our pollution in communities of color and have not made the investments that we need to clean up that pollution. And the costs of that are high. The health risks, the impacts on communities, the barriers that has created for people to access the economy and hold down regular jobs because they're dealing with life-threatening illnesses, that cost is too high. We can't afford to not invest in cleaning up legacy pollution in communities of color and low-income areas. So that's how I think about the prioritization process. And in terms of measuring success on climate, the measure of success is pretty easy. We have to make investments in infrastructure that allow us to rapidly shift away from fossil fuels in such a way that will allow us to cut our carbon emissions in half by 2030. If we don't hit that mark, if we don't meet that climate test, then we fail. We are looking at catastrophic climate change that is going to have major impacts, not only on communities here in the United States, but communities around the globe. So that's a pretty straightforward measure of success. That's the measure we're using when we're looking at what Congress is doing right now, and they need to put us on that path through the Build Back Better Act and the investment package that they're negotiating now. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathleen. And pointing to the political will that David was underlining as well. Very, very important. I want to raise a point that you brought up, Kathleen, which was related to adaptation and related to not designing things the same way that we've been designing them and with the same tools and data we've been designing them. Because what we need, in this term of resilience is, not just resilience to return to the same point, but we have to be resilient to a changing situation. And Bilal talked about deep uncertainty, for example. And so my question to you all is, how do we design things differently? How do we design for adaptation? How do we actually design things that adapt to a changing climate and to changing social situations and so forth? I wonder if, David, if you'd like to start.
This is not a technical challenge. It's not as if the technology is not there to do this. It's not as if there isn't the design and implementation capability to do this. It's simply there's not enough will. If you look at if you look on the carbon side, at the reduction in emissions over the years, it's been incremental, slowly, largely focused on the new build stock, not the existing build stock. And gradually it's been we've made improvements, but it's at a very slow increment. And I think it's almost focusing on codes and net zero is only ever going to likely affect the new build, which is 5% of the overall built environment. I think what we really need out of this this bill that's going through Congress is to actually be addressing the resilient infrastructure component, because you can work away at the building portfolio and the districts for the rest of our lifetimes. But I only have to look out the window half the time to see the nearby hills burning away or the whole of LA County covered in smoke. And coming back to the cost of these issues, it's not just the physical financial cost. There's the mental stress issues and health issues, which probably multiply those costs beyond belief. So, I recently sold my car that was 120,000 miles on the clock, and I'd had it for 12 years. And the reason I sold it was costing me more to maintain than it would be to get a new car that would have lower emissions as well. And at some point, that's where we are. It's costing so much more to band-aid everything together than it would be to once and for all accept the cost of what this is going to be and get on with it. And that's really where we are at the moment. And it's almost like it's not a design challenge anymore. We can do that. We've proved it. We can measure it. We just need to make the big decisions now. Take the pain.
Yes, Bilal, please go ahead.
If I may add, I think what Kathleen describing is beyond the capacity of the government to achieve. And I don't mean that she intended to be that way, that the government will fix things. I think if you take the trillions of dollars we're talking about, by the time you divvy them up by projects and states and sectors and so on, it's not much, right? So how can we achieve this? It has to be done by empowering everybody, empowering basically the entire country. In order to give the empowerment, I'll give you an example in a minute. The empowerment will be sufficient to change behavior, and then the change in that behavior will end up will spread, and there is no return, right? So if we do it that way, I think the investment that the government will put in could be quite impactful, and it will be lasting. I consulted recently for the World Bank. They were looking at Southeast Asia, and they wanted to help in creating climate resilient infrastructure. And again, they can't solve the problems of India or Bangladesh and Pakistan and all the countries there. So what the model that we looked at is basically to invest the difference between having a regular design based on the best practices that we have in engineering and so on, which we account for, by the way, for hazards and earthquakes and flooding and all of this. I mean, we are at the cutting edge in that regard. If I want to make it climate resilient, and the only added item will be the non-stationarity of the projections. What is the extra cost? And the World Bank will fund that delta, that's extra cost. So if India has a project on the books to do a highway system, we will give them a grant to cover the change from a regular project to climate resilient project. Now the strategy that this grant will end up becoming a behavior changing agent, meaning once the customer knows that this is an option I could ask for, all future projects will have that option. And once the engineering community figures out how it should be done, there will be no return, right? So basically the practice changed. In fact, in 2018, with the ASC Committee on Adaptation to Changing Climate, I tried to get funding to write a guide for the use of engineers. Engineers were asking for, how can we design for climate resilient infrastructure? We were ahead of the funding agencies. We could not get funding for that. We put together 12 volunteers, top-notch individuals, members of the national academies and engineers from New York and so on, and highly distinguished people. We wrote 250 pages, which is Manual of Practice number 140, and it received awards by the Engineering News Record, ASC President Medal, and so on, unfunded, to meet the need, because we could not wait for changes in the practice while we are building $1.3 trillion worth of infrastructure a year using the design practices that we have now. So we put in the way it needs to be done. So I think, to sum it up, I could say there is a need for empowerment, creating agents for change that will end up becoming, that it will take the communities to a point of no return, and it becomes expected from everybody to do it that way.
Can I jump in?
Please.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, you know, I agree with you, Bilal, that the federal government can't solve everything, and that's not what I was suggesting, but I would say the federal government has some pretty big levers that they can pull, and they haven't pulled them, and we need them to pull those levers now to put us on track to avoid even worse impacts of climate change. You know, I'll just take a couple of examples. The Build Back Better bill includes tax incentives for the production of wind energy and solar and other clean energy sources. And so that's just not like giving grants for project, that's like creating an incentive and changing the equation for clean energy producers to actually make it more cost effective for them to produce their electricity. It also, the tax incentives for electric vehicles, you know, that makes electric vehicles more affordable for families. So, I mean, the government has some levers that they can pull that will make substantial, really transformative shifts in behavior that will lead to emission reductions and help support the building of more resilient infrastructure. You know, I also say that I mentioned in my opening that we don't just need investments in the Build Back Better bill, but we do need those. We need every single one of those in order to get this job done. But we also need stronger regulations from EPA under the Clean Air Act. And that's a really important lever that the federal government has. And it's a responsibility that the federal government has to protect the health and well-being of communities. And those EPA Clean Air Act regulations have not been updated for a long time, and communities are paying the cost. So that's another important lever. Absolutely, companies, state governments, local governments, they need to take action. A lot of state and local governments are cash strapped, you know, especially in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of an economic crisis. They do not have funding in their coffers to invest in the kinds of projects that we've all been talking about. So getting some additional funding from the federal government to allow state and local governments to make the changes, to invest in infrastructure that is clean, that shifts us away from fossil fuels, and that is resilient to the impacts of climate change. I think that's an important role and a critical role that the federal government can play.
If I may just build on what Kathleen was saying with the EPA, I think protecting the environment, it's the cheapest way. Like protect wetlands, coastal wetlands do so much more than levees. I mean, it's cheaper to just let them function. And floodplains, let's not build in floodplains and respect nature and conserve what all the services that nature provides are priceless, and it's the cheapest just to not touch the environment. Retrofit the mistakes that we have done, and we see cities doing it now, but with daylighting rivers that were lined. Now they are restoring them to their natural state, and let nature help us in that resilience and climate change adaptation. And I think it's the cheapest way and most efficient.
Great. We are getting questions in our Q&A. So I'll turn to some of the audience questions, and a reminder to the audience that you can put questions in your Q&A. And one question we have here is how to promote equity across sectors when we are promoting resilience, including equity for farmers. So yeah, Adriana, great, please.
Yeah, let's bring them to the conversation, to the creation of programs. When you want to create a program to help farmers or to help affected communities, let's invite them and say what would work, because so many times we design programs that we think will help, but we don't really know, and they don't help the underserved communities. So bring them to the table, engage with them, and recognize that engaging underserved communities, it's hard, and they have many jobs, and we have to provide incentives for engagement. We have to compensate for their time, create, translation services, babysitting services, whatever is needed for the people to participate in the design of those programs. That would be the way to address justice in those things.
I think, when it comes equity does require political will. And until now, I doubt that there is the political will to achieve equity. So I think, and that was demonstrated by the elections and the way the country is split and so on. And there are special interest groups and people push agendas and things of this type. So I think it has really complexities that go way beyond the technical aspects of things. We know how to handle it from engineering, economics, finance, and so on. But the question really, fundamentally, is there the political will for affecting equity?
I think that's an important point. I'll also say that we have seen some really important shifts over the past year plus. I mean, the pandemic has highlighted how people who have not been able to participate in the economy equitably, who have not have access to safe, healthy environments, who are bombarded with pollution. These communities, often communities of color, have suffered the worst impacts of the pandemic, and also are the most at risk of climate change. And I think the awareness of that is, I don't think it's ever been higher. It was definitely spotlighted by the pandemic and recent climate disasters. President Biden ran on a very strong equity campaign, equity and justice, had very big commitments to environmental justice and climate justice. for the first time ever, there's a senior director for environmental justice in the White House. There's a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. We've never had these things in the past. Those are significant shifts. I think, Courtney, your question was, how do we promote equity across sectors? Well, in the policy sector, I mean, we have to, which touches, I guess, all sectors, we have to center our policies and projects on equity and justice goals. And we absolutely, as Adriana was saying, we need to meaningfully engage communities and make sure that our policies and the projects we're designing are really delivering on the priorities and needs that community members are identifying. And I think we have a long way to go. I will agree with you on that, Bilal, for sure. And we do need more political will, but I'm seeing more political will than I have in the past. And this is our moment to really make those long overdue investments and to, really build a fair and accessible and equitable economy. And we can do that as we shift toward clean energy resources. We have to do that. And this is the moment to make it happen.
Okay, Kathleen, if I may, just in the spirit of a conversation, right? I totally agree with you that there has been major initiatives by the Biden administration and so on to deal with equity. So you have new guards who are took over. To what extent those measures will be institutionalized? Because we have institutions, whether it's party and organizations and so on, and those are not easy to change. You have career individuals, you have filters and checks and committees and seniority and so on. And any remarks on that?
Yes, and I mean, those are all good points. Kathy Jacobs and I both worked in the Obama administration at the same time, so we experienced that firsthand. Executive action can be powerful. It really can, and that's everything from executive orders to regulation. And we have seen some really groundbreaking executive orders from the Biden administration. The challenge is those things can be rolled back. Regulations are harder to roll back, much harder to roll back, but they can. And this is why we are so focused on Congress right now and congressional action. I mean, we really do need Congress to act to tackle climate change, to invest in environmental justice, and in providing other social infrastructure that is, critical for communities across the country. And so agree with you, the administration can do a lot, but we need Congress to act. And this is the moment for Congress and the Biden administration to really join forces to tackle these very linked and interconnected challenges we're facing right now.
Great. Well, we will go to our concluding question for the evening, which is, what is the one thing that you hope people will take away from this event? And we'll go through each of our panelists. Let's start with Adriana, please.
Sure. What I wish our audience takes away is that resilience of infrastructure systems includes reducing vulnerabilities. To me, resilience means addressing inequities in vulnerability and adaptive capacity. And we can do this by putting justice at the core of resilience efforts and by having democratic decision-making processes that include the voices of underserved communities.
Very well said. Thank you, Adriana. Bilal, would you like to go?
Yes, I'll say the takeaway, the main item I try to emphasize is the importance of measurement and measurement science, because at the very end, we have limited resources. We have to maintain consistency in resource allocation, which is really a very important component when it comes to equity. So being able to quantify things across the board, whether we are dealing with social networks or it could be physical system or cyber and so on, and measuring things in a manner, in a consistent manner that lend itself for economic valuation will give us a strong basis, a foundation for achieving equity and justice.
Great. David, please.
The resilient infrastructure needs us to address social, economic, and environmental issues, not just the individual siloed components that make up those problems. And that whatever happens at the congressional level, ultimately ordinance changes and jurisdictions taking this forward and empowering the changes in building codes, which will make everyone do this. At the end of relying on people to be, just take the extra step isn't enough.
I totally agree with what the other panelists have shared. As I said in my opening, this is our climate and environmental justice moment. And the Biden administration and Congress really can and must pass a Build Back Better bill and an infrastructure package that puts us on this critical path to cut pollution in half by 2030. And they can do that while investing in environmental justice and other social infrastructure that families really need to live quality lives and to prosper. The investments I've highlighted that really need to be in the bill, I include the tax credits for clean electricity and clean vehicles and manufacturing, incentives for efficient and electric homes. These things can not only help families afford their energy bills and afford electric vehicles, but can also achieve substantial emission reductions. So we absolutely need these and other investments in climate and environmental justice in the bill. There's really no margin for error here. It will take all of the investments that are currently in the Build Back Better agenda to really achieve the goal we need to. And, Congress has been debating this plan for nearly 8 months. And this is the moment for them to really work through their disagreements and lock in a framework this week to really show the American people that they are serious about building a strong economy and tackling the climate crisis and environmental injustice.
Thank you, Kathleen. That's a really strong message to end on, and this is a very timely conversation. I think some of my main takeaways are that resilient infrastructure is built and social, both together. That measurement's important, but beyond measurement, that it's really political will. I don't hear from any of the engineers or architects here today that we feel like we don't know how to design resilient infrastructure, that it's really, like Kathleen's pushing us towards, it's really, we must act now, and it's overdue. And lastly, of course, to engage with communities in meaningful ways, to make sure that the policies and the infrastructure that we are putting forward is equitable and thoughtful and is responsive directly to their needs and desires. So with that, I want to thank all the panelists, also the Arizona Institute for Resilience staff, the Water Resources Research Center, the Udall Center, and special thanks to all the participants who joined us today. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Kathy.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Courtney did a great job. And Kathleen, talk about timeliness. Obviously, this is the week and the month where this conversation is about as important as it could ever be. And of course, it's critically important in Arizona in particular. So I'm hoping that those of you who have stuck with us today took note of the importance of engaging with your elected officials, because obviously, this is the time, and they do actually respond when citizens check in with them. So please do that. Obviously, this issue of leadership is so critical to the path forward. And we've all seen this. When there are strong leaders, we can overcome enormous obstacles. and just hope that this is the moment that they can actually get this ball moving. The idea also of not reinventing the wheel related to everything having to do with adaptation and mitigation. If we can have a learning process as we go along instead of continuing to make the same mistakes, that would be great. One of my pet projects, of course, is working on assessments, and assessing what works and what doesn't work is pretty critical if you want to improve processes over time. Anyway, with that, I will thank once again all the panelists. You were all spectacular, and I thought the way that everybody's comments intersected was excellent. So we appreciate your joining us, and hope that you will fill out the form to give us an idea of how well it is that you think we did or didn't do, with suggestions for our next one, which is about biodiversity, water, and climate change in the Southwest on November 17th from 4 to 5:30. This is a critical issue. I'm sure you're all aware that biodiversity is really taking it in the shorts, so to speak, in the context of climate change. Anyway, thanks a lot to all of you, and have a good evening, and go save the planet. Thanks a lot.